worry, it's not a big, long speech. So welcome to the Nash Lecture. Very happy to see you all here. I'll just introduce myself for those of you who don't know who I am. I'm Dr. Christian Regal, Professor of Health and Medical Humanities and English here at Campion College. And I'm chair of the Nash Lecture Committee. So my role essentially tonight is to sort of MC, direct a little bit of traffic, and kind of make sure things are flowing along. So I'll be handing things off in a moment to Father Sammy Halawa to give an introduction, so we'll do that in a moment. But I wanted to just say before we get going, how excited I am by this lecture. I mean, it's an exciting topic. Our committee was excited like all year talking about this. And by Dr. John Zilcosky, who's coming to us from the University of Toronto. We've been buzzing about it for a long time. The Nash Lecture itself is a really wonderful event for us at the college. It's a memorial lecture founded in 1979 by Father Joseph Gavin to honor the first president of Campion College. And so we have this sort of annual celebration of our first president, of our college, of our community, and it gets people to come in and say hello and have some drinks and snacks after, of course. I'll remind you about that. I think that's kind of it for the beginning parts. I'd like to invite Father Sammy Halawa, our president, to come and give a formal welcome.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's good to see you all here, and thank you for coming. Welcome to Campion College and to our annual Nash Lecture for 2024. I'm very pleased that you are joining us this evening to a very interesting topic by a very interesting man and professor and scholar. It's a bit unusual topic, but important to have insights about sports in general, and especially wrestling, because sports bring good spirits to the campus life. This is a fact that is given from our experiences across many universities. We also have, I would like to acknowledge now some people who are present here. I will start with our Christian institution next to us, Sister One, Dr. Mark Jerry, the president of Luther College, is here. And of course, the dean of Luther College, Dr. Yvonne Petrie, is here. So thank you for both of your presence. And I would like also to acknowledge the executive director of the Mother Teresa Middle School, Mr. Curtis Kleisinger, is also with us here. I hope I pronounced your name right. I did? Okay, good. Campion College is the only Canadian Jesuit institution in higher education. Federated to the University of Regina and situated at its campus on Treaty 4 territory with the presence of Treaty 6. This is the ancestor territory of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota people, and the traditional homeland of the Michif Nation. Nash Lecture is named after the first Campion College president, one of my predecessors. His name was Father Peter Nash, S.J., who was instrumental to promote further, through his personal charisma, the Jesuit tradition in higher education to our region here in southern Saskatchewan, especially in Regina. His legacy we remember this evening as we continue to keep the annual lecture to draw in key academic scholars in their fields by offering them opportunities to expand our intellectual imagination into new frontiers. So this evening lecture is thus within our Jesuit tradition in advanced education. Your presence with us this evening affirms what we do as a college. We teach, we're educators. Encourage us also to pursue knowledge that helps us discern truth in matters of concern. Let's not forget the motto of our college, Substantia Regina, which in English means wisdom reigns or wisdom is queen. So at this time of our history, at a turning point toward our future, the pursuit of wisdom is indispensable to understand the signs of our time and to discover the invitation by the Holy Spirit. Intellectual ministry is thus a means for greater horizon of impactful knowledge. The topic of wrestling, I did some research today. It's a very popular sport, even among royal families in the Middle Ages, in England and France, and even in Japan. But wrestling is more ancient than Middle Ages. There is drawings of wrestling inside caves in France at one time. But also there are biblical references to wrestling. I'll give you a couple of them, both from the book of Genesis. One from chapter 30. And Rachel said, with great wrestling, have I wrestled with my sister, and have prevailed. The other quote is one maybe more familiar with Jacob. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. That's from Genesis chapter 32. I tried very hard to find jokes on wrestling. But Alexa helped me today. AI. What's the difference between hockey and wrestling? In hockey, the fight is real. But of course, our opinions are gonna change on this once our speaker will give us his presentation on wrestling. I would like now to ask you or him. Yeah, Tom. Tom is our dean, Tom Phoenix, Dr. Tom, and he will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Dr. John Zilcosky is a professor of German and comparative literature at Victoria College at the University of Toronto. He teaches and writes about modern European literature, psychoanalysis, the art of travel, and the history of sports. He co-edited with Marlowe Burke's The Allure of Sports in Western Culture, and was also an editor for Alternative Temporalities, Emancipatory Power of Narrative. His books include Kafka's Travels, Exoticism, Colonialism, and the Traffic of Writing, a Modern Language Association Prize winner for the best book in German studies. Writing Travel, The Poetics and Politics of the Modern Journey. Uncanny Encounters, Literature, Psychoanalysis, and the End of Alterity. And The Language of Trauma, War and Technology in Hoffman, Freud, and Kafka. This recent 2021 book examines the reactions of 3 European writers to modern trauma in the 19th and the 20th centuries. This interdisciplinary work describes the substantial social, economic, and intellectual historical impacts of law, medicine, and literature in historical fact, medical detection, and, this threw me a bit, accident insurance. The Times Literary Supplement and the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung have reviewed his work. He has received grants from Schurk, the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, and the U.S. National Endowment for the Humanities. The German government awarded him the Friedrich Wilhelm Bessel Prize for outstanding achievements in research. He recently won a fellowship from the Guggenheim Foundation, supporting research on his book, Brutal Embrace, The Story of Wrestling, which is under advanced contract with the University of Chicago Press. Tonight, Dr. Zilcosky will present our 42nd Nash lecture based on work from his upcoming book. The title, as you probably all know, is Brutal Embrace, Wrestling with Heroes, where he will argue that the activity of wrestling was an attempt by early cultures to indulge and control their urge for violence. Yay. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Zilcosky.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom, and also to Christian and Sammy for the invitation and just in general for the really warm welcome I've received here in Regina during my first trip ever to Regina, and also especially this morning for Dwayne Meisner, who invited me to come and speak to his undergraduates on ancient sport, and I had a chance to be impressed by the quality of your students. It was a wonderful experience. So as the introducer said, this is part of an ongoing project for me. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to present it to you, because I'm spending a lot of time just by myself working on it. This is the opening section of a long book on the history of wrestling. So today I'm really going to concentrate on two stories from ancient Greek myth. The first one being the wrestling match between Hercules, in Greek Heracles, and Antaeus, and the second being the match toward the end of the Iliad between Odysseus and Ajax the Great. So here we go. The ancient Greeks told of a monstrous giant ranging the coast of North Africa, challenging all passers-by to wrestle. The travelers had no option but to fight. The mightiest of these succeeded in throwing the giant, even pinning him into the sand. But as they held him, feeling ever more certain of victory, they sensed his limbs regaining power. The giant became strong again in their arms, burst their embrace, and rose. They threw him again, but again he gained vitality on the ground, broke their bonds, and attacked. Rumor spread that this giant was the son of Mother Earth, who invigorated him every time he touched her. All victories over him were Pyrrhic. Each time he fell, he absorbed fresh potency. He let his opponents slam him to the ground over and again till they exhausted themselves. When they were drained, standing weakened before him, the giant became bloodthirsty, choosing, like most mythological wrestlers, not just to throw his opponent, but to kill him. He then dishonored their corpses, using their skulls to decorate the temple of his father, Poseidon. One day, a new traveler arrived. The myths said he was the son of a divine father and a mortal mother who herself was a wrestler. Skilled at grappling already as a boy, he had out-wrestled mighty opponents like the Nemean lion, the goddess Echelus, and Thanatos, the personification of death. Because of this traveler's fame as a wrestler, the Athenians eventually appointed him to be a patron of their palestras, which were named after wrestling palestra itself. This traveler was part of the new race of demigods from Mount Olympus, determined to rid the world of monsters like the giant, and to replace these giants' arbitrary violence with systems of justice. These rule lovers devised new plans to curb violence, including the astonishing invention of a form of wrestling that did not end, as it always had, in murder. On Olympus, judges determined the victor based on scorekeeping. The loser walked away on his own 2 feet. Some said that this traveler's father, the most powerful god on Olympus, Zeus, had defeated his own father, Kronos, in such a match. By the way, in Pausanias, if anyone wants to look this up. Yeah. Zeus had out-wrestled Kronos, but then chosen not to kill him, allowing him to walk away, humiliated but alive. To honor this victory over his father and over his own primitive urges, Zeus now staged, every 4 years, a series of competitions based on rules. Of all the contests, wrestling was the most important because it was the most primal and, more important, the one in which Zeus had established his reputation as both a fighter and a god of justice. He had defeated his opponent and, for the first time recorded anyway in Greek history, had allowed the loser of a wrestling match to live. This appearance now of Zeus's son, Heracles, on the African coast thus presaged not just a physical clash, but also a clash of civilizations, or better, a clash of civility against barbarism. The giant, Antaeus, rubbed sand from the earth into his limbs to keep his mother's power close to him. Heracles, conversely, followed the guidelines of the first Olympian science of sport. He was the first wrestler ever to arrive at his match with a bag of equipment. He opened this sack and pulled out an arabolos, a ceramic flask filled with oil. He rubbed this on his body. According to the new science, this would limber his muscles and slow the loss of fluid, giving him an advantage over the brute. The two wrestlers' opposing physiques likewise symbolize the battle of barbarism versus civilization. Antaeus was larger and more densely muscled, with a head that seemed to grow straight out of his shoulders. He had a breast as hard as iron and arms as thick as trees. Ancient historians called him, quote, a wild beast. Heracles' body, on the other hand, was supple and symmetrical, resembling a work of art. It exemplified the aesthetic qualities that marked humans as human, radiating the elegance and refinement that the Greeks called charisma, or grace. This same division appeared in the competitors' modes of wrestling. Antaeus was known for his uncontrolled, ungainly style. He was ham-handed, untrained, and muscle-bound. He seemed to have no style at all, only strength. Heracles' method, conversely, resided primarily in skill. Another hero like Heracles, Theseus, had founded the first Greek school of wrestling around precisely this idea of technique, techne. Because technique could be learned, it could theoretically be perfected by anyone, giving smaller people, for the first time, the capacity of defeating someone bigger. Heracles' possession of technique marked him as an avatar of progress. Finally, and most importantly for what I'm talking about today, the combatants were psychologically different. Antaeus was a beast who knew only rage. Heracles, on the other hand, followed the principles of his father, Zeus, who had allowed the defeated Kronos to walk away. Before Heracles begins his match against Antaeus, he thus reminds himself to, quote, put a curb upon his anger, end quote. And now, the match between Heracles and Antaeus begins. The two men charge forward and grip each other. Heracles feels the giant sweating and beginning to tire. Seizing the moment, he twists Antaeus off balance and throws him to the ground, holding him down in the sand. Heracles mounts his body on top of Antaeus's and squeezes Antaeus's torso. He enwraps his calves and ankles around Antaeus's legs. He has Antaeus's back pinned to the ground. Heracles' pinhold, and by the way, the Greeks had a quite advanced lexicon of wrestling moves, unlike any other ancient society. His pinhold is the most basic one, known since the beginning of time, and in its crudest form by every child. Today's judo fighters call it tati shiogatame. For wrestlers and Brazilian jiu-jitsu fighters, it's called the full mount. And it is what it sounds like. The attacker lies on top of his opponent, belly to belly, blanketing him as in the missionary position. He encircles the other's torso or head with his arms, and if this is not sufficiently paralyzing, simultaneously assails the legs with a grapevining technique. I'll show you this in a second. He now extends his feet and head and lifts them, stretching and raising his opponent's head and feet off the ground. This incapacitates the opponent, preventing the bridging motion that would allow him to escape, and causes him great pain. He is stretched at both ends as if on a medieval rack. I'm going to show you a modern image of this. There are actually no ancient images of this initial part of the fight. There's lots of images of the second part of the fight. So here is, this is a modern image. It's kind of hard to see, and it's down low, but I just want to show you, he's lying, the man on the top, this is from an Olympic judo competition. The man lying on top is, like I said, in the missionary position, straight on top of him, has his arms, and this is the way Philostratus describes what Heracles does to Antaeus. His arms locked around the head of the torso, and this is the great binding of the legs. So he stretches the upper body forward and stretches the legs back. It is, to this day, a move that's nearly impossible to escape. When this happens in the Olympics, in judo or wrestling, generally the match is over. It was proven repeatedly by the judo world champion and master of this tate shiogatame from the 1970s and 80s, a Japanese champion named Katsuhiko Kashiwazaki. And here he is doing the same move. But not here, not with Antaeus. So despite this tight, full mount, Heracles feels, of course, Antaeus reinvigorating. The giant's body swells inside Heracles' arms. It escapes the full mount and springs up. The two men interlock again. This time, Antaeus does not even wait to be thrown. He breaks free and throws himself to the earth. Immediately regaining strength, he attacks again. At this point, the tiring Heracles snakes his arms around the giant's chest and embraces him. You here see the image and the term that's also the title of my talk today. Heracles secures what the Greeks eventually codified as their foundational wrestling move. In Greek, it's called the hamma, H-A-M-M-A. This word has a broad meaning, signifying anything that is tied or bound, but also a clinch between two men, and more specifically, in terms of Greek wrestling, a so-called wrestler's hug, what we today would call the bear hug. The attacker hugs the opponent's belly to his own, squeezing all the air out of him. Then he lifts the opponent, arches his own back, and tosses the opponent over the attacker's own back. I'll also show an image of this. In the perfect hamma, the attacker's body is in a full bridge, while the opponent flies over top of him and lands on his face or neck and rolls onto his back. Both Olympic and professional wrestling use this move today, calling it the suplex, with the most famous one ever executed, if you don't count the body throw between Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant, the most ever executed in Olympic sport was in 1972 in Munich by a man named Wilfried Dietrich, who only weighed about 110 kilograms, which might sound like a lot, but he threw the American Chris Taylor, who weighed almost 200 kilograms, 440 pounds, with this technique, to show you what technique is capable of doing. So here it is. This is arguably the most famous Olympic photograph ever. So, oops, that wasn't what I wanted. So this man on the bottom here, Dietrich, he looks tiny, but like I said, I think he weighed about 110 or 120 kilos. Chris Taylor weighs 200 kilos. This is the suplex. The arms wrapped around the body, the chest pressed to chest, and thrown straight overwards, over the back. This is what Heracles seems to be trying to do to Antaeus. And as I said, this was already codified in Greek wrestling techniques. By the way, a little story. No one has ever been able to prove this, but they said that this man here, Wilfried Dietrich, who had won a couple of gold medals in Olympics before, he had known that he wanted to try this against Chris Taylor, but he didn't know if his arms were long enough to wrap around Taylor's girth. So the athletes in Olympic villages will often hang around together. So he was hanging around with Chris Taylor and just jokingly said, "So nice to see you," and hugged him, just to see if the fingers would touch, and they did, yeah. So he knew he'd be able to try it. The move can also be applied from the back, a so-called back suplex. This is from the last Olympics in Tokyo. So wrestling. Olympic wrestling, the move can be brutal and it's extremely dangerous. Olympic wrestling regulates it carefully, and it is illegal in the US and Canadian high school circuits. A Japanese pro wrestler broke his opponent's neck and killed him with this move in 2009. So Heracles seems now ready to inflict such a suplex on Antaeus as he tightens his embrace and lifts him. But Heracles knows that Antaeus will gain strength when he hits the ground. So he devises a new strategy. Holding Antaeus in the air, Heracles does something remarkable. He does not give in to his rage and suplex the giant brutally to the sand. Instead, he controls himself and deliberately does not throw him. He just keeps Antaeus' body lifted. Antaeus kicks wildly, straining to touch his Mother Earth, but Heracles keeps him in the air. Holding Antaeus high, he announces, quote, "Here you shall remain, with your body clasped in my embrace." But Heracles now faces a different opponent, himself. After lifting the giant, quote, aloft with the wrestler's hug, the hama in Greek, Heracles could demand that Antaeus change his ways. Think of the modern options here, right? He could accept a promise of reform, or even send him to prison, or exile him, as was the case with Kronos. But what is remarkable is how little Heracles considers any such options. Instead, he, quote, lifts him aloft with the hama, breaks and kills him, end quote. Wrestling's modern civility does not even make it to the end of the sentence. Heracles tightens the hug bit by bit, torturing Antaeus till he loses his breath. Heracles feels the giant's breast getting cold and stiff in his arms, mirroring Heracles' own cold-bloodedness. No longer able to curb his anger, Heracles violates his own rules, becoming a plain murderer, no different from the monster he had come to civilize. Heracles also commits the sexual violence omnipresent in primitive wrestling. The Greek hero Peleus had already immobilized the goddess Thetis in a wrestler's hug and raped her, conceiving Achilles. And when Heracles uses this hug to kill the African giant, we see a similar undercurrent. And the text is coming from two different sources, from Apollodorus and from Philostratus. Heracles grabs Antaeus, quote, at the middle, just above the waist, where the ribs are, and sets him upright on his thigh. And the description, by the way, is more fitting to this one. It is a front grab, as it's described in the Greek text. And then Heracles presses his forearm into Antaeus', quote, flabby and panting stomach. A Greek sculptor from the 4th or 5th century BC depicted this as a sensual murder. I'll show you this image in a second, as did modern artists ranging from an anonymous Florentine Renaissance sculptor to the Baroque Spanish painter Francisco de Zurbarán. So here, and here it's depicted, you see, as a back suplex. And this is the Greek sculpture from estimate 4th or 5th century BC. This is the anonymous Florentine Renaissance sculpture entitled Heracles and Antaeus. And then the Baroque Spanish painting from Zurbarán with this very powerful image of Heracles looking directly at the viewer as he strangles the monster Antaeus to death. Ancient myth, furthermore, told of Heracles claiming the traditional droit de seigneur of the victorious wrestler. Depending on what accounts you read, he took either Antaeus' lover or his daughter as his sexual spoils. This traveler from Olympus, whose people had taught themselves to wrestle without murdering or raping, had come to Africa and done both. Wrestling provides Heracles with victory and power. a power that he then abuses, as many men have throughout history. Prince Siegfried's violation of the mighty Brunhild while wrestling her Ringen is one of the most upsetting moments in the medieval Nibelungenlied. Both Siegfried and Heracles prefigure the Brazilian jiu-jitsu grapplers who raped a female teammate in 2013. This was in the news a bit because these jiu-jitsu workout rooms are places where men and women regularly grapple together on the ground in somewhat dangerous positions, so it was seen as a horrible breach of trust. As the critic Jennifer Doyle wrote of that 2013 case, quote, "Rape is a violation of the bonds of trust and dependence that make the sport of grappling even thinkable," end quote. Unlike boxing, wrestling incites more than just aggression. Its bodily closeness also stimulates the temptation to rape, regardless of the gender of the opponent. And it demands control of this temptation. So why does wrestling become the exemplar of this self-control? And what is so important, historically speaking, about this sport? The legendary match between Heracles and Antaeus begins to answer these queries, and more important, it gets to the heart of the questions I'm posing here today. And that is, why have humans wrestled from the beginning of time? Human evolution need not have necessarily taken this route of inventing sport at all, and why particularly wrestling? Was it to honor the gods, or to establish social and sexual hierarchies, or to satisfy our elemental competitive spirit, or our desire for brutal entertainment, or all of the above? Solon, who was a famous Athenian lawgiver from the 5th century BC, offered his own theory in a historical fiction penned by a later Greek writer named Lucian. According to Lucian, Solon believes that the three oldest sports, wrestling, running, and boxing, are vital to civic culture. They prepare citizens to defend their country, he claims, and less obviously makes the citizens peaceful within their own cities. Solon uses wrestling, the most widely practiced and discussed of Greek sports, as his main example. Wrestling is an essential skill in battle, Solon claims. For the moment when weapons fall or when antagonists get too close so that weapons become useless. As medieval Japanese jiu-jitsu fighters had learned, punching enemies wearing armor and helmets did not work, but pinning, choking, and arm-barring them did. Many Greek writers had noted the same. For Aeschylus, a soldier is merely an accomplished grappler in hoplite gear, a, quote, wrestler in armor. Sophocles calls the Trojan warriors, quote, wrestlers with a clanging shield. Plutarch reminds us that the Athenians defeated the Spartans at Leuctra because they, unlike the Spartans, were, quote, practiced wrestlers. Tripping and throwing, Solon now argues, convert easily from the palestra to the battlefield. And wrestlers were not only good at throwing, they were also good at being thrown because they were used to it, so they could quickly return to their feet after a knockdown. And they also learned how to drag other bodies during matches, so they know how to pull captured enemies or injured comrades from the fray. This is all part of Solon's argument. The wrestler's most important trait for warfare is, Solon insists, mental toughness, born out of their daily regimen of suffering and self-mastery. The greatest Greek wrestler and most famous ancient athlete in any sport, Milo of Croton, originated the laborious system that we today at your gyms and so on will call progressive overload training. 4 years before the next Olympics, Milo found a small calf and lifted it over his head. He continued to do so every day for 4 years till the calf was fully grown into a cow. Milo then appeared in Olympus carrying the adult bull over his shoulders. Talk about intimidating your opponents before the match, right? Yeah. Milo's psychological discipline emerged from the daily routine that all wrestlers knew. They grappled all day in the mud and the sand, beneath the hot sun, enduring great thirst. They sweated and bled on one another. This made them, Solon argues, not just physically robust, but mentally resilient. Dripping, hemorrhaging bodies on the battlefield would be nothing unusual for a wrestler. And this is why, Solon says, wrestlers were always the last ones to retreat. Solon's second and more surprising reason for championing violent sports is that they increase domestic tranquility. He points to Athens' remarkable lack of social violence, unlike cities with less developed sporting traditions. Athenians do not carry weapons on the streets, as barbarians do, Solon argues. The wrestlers' particularly arduous workouts rechannel their excess vitality. This redirection keeps them occupied, leaves them pleasantly exhausted, and vents their violent impulses. At the end of the day, they have no energy and no desire to pick a fight. What is more, wrestling teaches young men to trust themselves and others. The rough play that they call pale wrestling is difficult to distinguish from real violence, especially in the heat of battle. But grapplers know this distinction. To teach it, the Greeks often placed their mythical heroes in complicated fighting situations where they could confuse wrestling with plain violence. In these borderline cases, neither trust nor restraint comes easily. Heracles arrives in Africa to civilize Antaeus by engaging in pale wrestling, not war, polemos. But he ends up perpetrating the latter. Young grapplers in the Palestra would have heard this story with two ears, one enjoying the tale of heroic victory, and the other knowing that they, as real wrestlers, were not allowed to give rein to their rage. Lucian's Solon echoes the argument of many Greek philosophers, including the champion grappler Plato. By the way, at least one telling of where Plato got his name was that Plato was actually a nickname coming from the Greek word of broad, meaning broad shoulders, and it was given to him by his coach. But he competed in the Pythian Games. We do know this, so he was quite accomplished. That wrestling is the best way to prepare young men, quote, both for peace and for war. The Greeks placed their boys, like their mythological heroes, in this activity where tempers flared, and then told them to control themselves, yet still try to win. Wrestling was the perfect activity for this mixture of violence and restraint. It was the only combat sport that did not end in concussion or submission, but rather in a referee's judgment. Controlling one's emotions is especially hard in wrestling because it insists that the combatants not remain at arm's length. It produces an intimate violence unknown in other sports, approximated today perhaps only by American football or rugby. As Plutarch argued, runners aimed, this is Plutarch's table talk, people sitting around debating the different sports and what their qualities are. And Plutarch said, runners aimed to put maximum distance between one another, and boxers were not allowed to clinch. The referee pulls them apart when they clinch, but wrestlers always embraced. This gave wrestling its Greek name, he says, its name of pale, issuing from to draw near, plesiatzein, and to be close, pelas. This physical intimacy created a level of vulnerability that we normally expect only from love. And now to refer to something that Sami talked about a minute ago, Jacob in Genesis bear-hugged God, it's not clear at the point in Genesis it's referred to as a man, all night to get a blessing, but also perhaps to get a furtive pleasure, as inferred by interpreters from Rembrandt to Delacroix to Bonnat, I'll show you some of these modern interpretations. First, Rembrandt's Jacob wrestling the angel. And then two from the 19th century. The next one's from about 1850 by Eugène Delacroix, Jacob wrestling the angel. And then from the late 19th century by Léon Bonnat. Here. And the Mesopotamian giants, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, long before the Greeks, embraced brutally till they mysteriously stopped and became loving friends. Wrestlers are fully stimulated and in physical danger, yet they still agree not to violate or seriously injure the other in the sport of wrestling. Because of the intimacy of this combat, wrestling, that ancient tool of war, became for Solon the key to maintaining domestic peace. I'd like now to address a question that might be going through some of your heads, and that is, why wrestling and not, say, boxing? Would boxing not fill many of the same requirements? And why did early cultures hold wrestling in much higher esteem than boxing? To answer this, let us turn to pre-classical Greece, to Homer, who championed wrestling as he did no other sport. He gives it pride of place in his Iliad, the oldest surviving Greek literary text, by inserting it immediately after the death of Achilles' best friend in the Trojan War. Achilles mounts an elaborate funeral, and his troops perform sports in honor of the deceased. This is book 23 of the Iliad. Boxing serves here as an insignificant prelude to the wrestling. When Achilles calls for volunteers, he offers the victor the second-rate prize of an unbroken mule. That wasn't going to do much for you. And not surprisingly, the greatest of the Achaeans stays seated. A trivial figure named Epeius steps forward. He appears nowhere else in the Iliad, and only briefly in other ancient texts, where he is described as a, quote, coward and a poor soldier, quote, I fall short in battle. Epeius's insecurity reveals itself immediately in the Iliad when he announces overweening threats at a not yet named opponent. Quote, I will smash his skin apart and break his bones on each other. Let those who care for him wait nearby in a huddle about him to carry him out after my fists have beaten him under. At this point, another figure barely mentioned in Greek literature, Euryalus, stands to face him. These two nobodies lift their fists and approach one another. The encounter is predictably brief and vulgar. The braggart Epeius throws one punch, which lands on Euryalus' face. Euryalus falls straight to the ground. His friends haul him away, his feet dragging, his head lolling to one side, and his mouth dripping thick blood. Epeius receives his ridiculous award, and Euryalus, brutally concussed, is too confused to collect his consolation prize. Such undignified scenes lend weight to historians' claims that boxing was, quote, the least respected of Greek sports. Compare this to the wrestling, which Achilles now announces, offering the winner a sacrificial tripod. Now, this might not sound like much to you, but such tripods were sacred to Apollo, and they were extremely expensive. The Phaeacians had to assess a general tax after offering some of these tripods to Odysseus in the Odyssey. Not surprisingly, two of Achilles' bravest and most decorated comrades present themselves, Odysseus and Telamonian Ajax the Great. In direct contrast to the coward Epeius, they say not a word. They stride forward, brimming with silent confidence. Homer employs now the technical detail typical of Greek depictions of wrestling. The two men grip each other, quote, in the hook of their heavy arms, meaning that they apply overhooks and underhooks, a popular opening gambit depicted on Greek pottery, including on this 4th century BCE vase. There's lots of depictions of wrestling just on household items. Lots of Greek pottery will have this. So you see here the over-under, the right arm underneath the left armpit. Here, this man's right arm goes underneath this man's left armpit. And then what's happening in the story is this man's right arm in the Iliad will go under his left arm, and his left arm goes over the top. That is what Homer means by in the hook of their heavy arms. Odysseus' right arm digs under Ajax's armpit. Oops, do that again. So right here. And snakes around his back, while Ajax's does the same under Odysseus' opposite armpit. Both men then close their left arms tightly over the other's right. Each man is hard on the other's chest. I'll show you what the next stage of this is. In the match-launching embrace that appears everywhere throughout the history of wrestling. We see it not only in ancient ceramics, but also in medieval fight books. So this is an early 15th century medieval fight manual. By the way, when the printing press was invented, one of the most popular genre were fight manuals. The idea that people wanted to know how to defend themselves, and it seemed like a really practical thing. And if you go online now, the equivalent today are instructions in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and MMA fighting. It's a practical thing to know, right? So there's still a lot of surviving fight manuals from this time period. I mean, this was actually before the printing press, right? This is 15th century, but later on you see them also with beautiful sketchings of wrestling by Albrecht Dürer. But here you see what happens next. The over-under leads to the clasping behind the back. And here is what I'm talking about. This is just one of many. When you go online and type in over-under martial arts fighting manuals, you see things like this in today's internet world. Odysseus and Ajax clinch snugly till their bodies seem to be joined as one. Thus, I just said Ojax, right? Even as something non-human. They join, Homer says, quote, as when rafters lock, when a renowned architect has fitted them in the roof of a high house, end quote. Each man now has his hands loose behind the other's back and aims to clasp them. So here you see, it would look something like this. And the goal then is to get the arms to cross in the back like these two men have it here. Homer writes, quote, their backs creaked under stress of violent hands that tugged them stubbornly. Interlocking ever tighter, they reach for that hug that Heracles captured against Antaeus. The two men literally embody the intimate violence known only to wrestling. Homer describes this poetically, showing these great straining bodies transforming into one. Each body part is no longer, quote, his, no longer Odysseus's or Ajax's, but, quote, theirs. Each man now manages to lock hands behind the other's back, gaining the full body wrap, the hama. Each wrestler attempts to shift the other off balance. The dance is slow and brutal, sophisticated and bloody at once. And it is difficult for the audience to differentiate the two bodies, to recognize which limbs belong to whom. Unlike the vulgar boxing, which began with two non-entities insisting on their individuality, the wrestling match opens with two supermen swaying together in mythical and transfixing oneness. But this embrace eventually becomes monotonous for the watching comrades. All of the soldiers are circled around watching this fight. Ajax notices this, and he whispers into Odysseus' ear. You see, you're very close to the ear here with your mouth. And he says, lift me, or I will lift you. But to attempt such a lift carries risk. the attacker must step forward between the other's legs and transfer weight from one foot to the other. This puts the attacker, regardless of how experienced, momentarily off balance. Each fighter knows this, and each is skilled enough to take advantage of the other's decision to attack by counterattacking at this moment. This is the intricate dance of wrestling, a two-person ballet governed by caution and absolute readiness. The opponent might attack powerfully and move himself off balance only once in an entire match. The other must be ready to seize this decisive moment, which the Greeks called kairos, referring both to debate contests, the decisive moment there, and to wrestling. When Ajax calls for someone to step forward and attack, he is forcing this kairos to occur. And Ajax himself, not surprisingly, now takes this risk. He tightens his hama, the grip around the body, steps forward and attempts a lift. He wants to throw Odysseus, most likely in the grand amplitude suplex. The suplex is the preferred move of men who, like Ajax, rely primarily on strength. Although Ajax is not only enormous like the cowardly boxer soldier Epeios, for Ajax has war smarts, but he remains known in the Iliad for his size and his power. Odysseus possesses less strength, so he must respond with his famous metis, meaning cunning or craft. The Greek word metis is the most common epithet for Odysseus, and it's often expanded, as in the onset of this match, to polymetis, the man of many wiles, of many crafts or much cunning. And wily Odysseus now employs a sophisticated counterattack. He surreptitiously slips his leg behind Ajax's, which Ajax has just moved forward to attempt this throw. So Ajax takes the risk of stepping forward, and the moment he does, Odysseus takes advantage, and I'll show you in a second what he does. Timing here is everything. If Odysseus had sneaked his leg behind Ajax's before Ajax began transferring his weight to it, Ajax would have remained fully balanced. If Odysseus had waited too long, Ajax would have already planted his foot and lifted Odysseus in the air. But Ajax's reliance on strength over cunning gave Odysseus an edge. For Ajax had announced that someone must attempt a lift, and the crafty Odysseus knew who this someone would be. He could thus time his counterattack perfectly. Because of this timing, Odysseus requires virtually no strength. He steps behind Ajax's leg and taps him in the hollow of the knee just before Ajax's advancing foot hits the ground. Odysseus merely continues the forward momentum at Ajax's foot, sweeping it ever farther forward as it hovers just centimeters above the earth. Odysseus now pushes his torso lightly into the mighty Ajax's. A swivel effect ensues, with Ajax's foot flying ever farther forward. Imagine something like this, almost like slipping on the ice, is how he gets pulled forward. And Ajax's torso careens backward toward the ground. He lands flat on his back with a crash. This same move, and what's remarkable, because the human body hasn't changed that much, wrestling moves are extremely similar as they were over 2,000 years ago. And this same move is as useful today as it was in Odysseus's mythical Bronze Age. Competitors in freestyle wrestling, judo, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and mixed martial arts call this today the outside leg trip, or ouchi-gaishi. The attacker reaps the opponent's leg at the pressure point in the hollow in the knee of the knee, and, as Homer writes, quote, unnerves the tendons. The opponent's leg collapses as if broken. I'm not going to show, I don't have a video of this, but I'll show you a still. That's it. So the attacker originally is the man in the blue. He has stepped forward. You don't see the beginning of it, but he steps forward with his right leg in between the legs of the guy in the white is initially the defender. But he reacts to that first step forward and gets him, as Homer describes it, in the hollow of the knee and begins to push him backwards. So in the fight, this would be Odysseus' counterattack against the mighty Ajax. So this is about halfway through the move. With the opponent's torso now falling back, the attacker presses against it and sends him tumbling. The move requires barely any strength, merely the skills one learns in the wrestling room, the dojo, or in Odysseus' case, the palestra. Technique, timing, and cunning. Unlike size, such skills can be acquired, and they can create a revolution in human relations. The smaller person must no longer automatically fear the larger one. When Odysseus lands thunderously atop Ajax's chest, the dust flies, and the comrades gaze upon this miracle. They, quote, wonder, as they did not wonder after the boxing. Lo, the smaller man has won. Odysseus embodies this modern marvel even more than Heracles did when he defeated the giant Antaeus. Heracles used the hama, the simplest of moves, preferred by big men, and he used it to commit murder. Odysseus employs a technique that is more complicated than the hama and more boring, less dramatic. Look here, right? It's not the same as when having Chris Taylor way up in the air like that. The leg trip. Odysseus' victory in this round is a victory for cunning, for metis, over brawn. The Greek word was bia, for strength. And it is a victory for the modern urban wrestling schools over the rural sites of mythological murder. Greek wrestling, though, required 3 falls to win. So this match isn't over. This is just the first fall. The two men rise and they re-engage, and this time Odysseus attacks. He enwraps Ajax and attempts a lift, but he cannot lift the behemoth. So he budges him just slightly upward to his toes, which is often enough to complete an attack. So Odysseus steps behind Ajax's leg again, tries the same thing, hooks a knee, but this time Ajax is ready. He eludes the trip, holds his balance, and the two men crash together sideways into the dust with no clear winner of this second throw. And what happens next? This is the thing about wrestling. Like it sounds very boring, but it's not. And that's why Homer's so interested in it, devotes so much more time to its description than the boxing thing. But what follows next, it's something truly unexpected in the history of Greek sports. The two men leap up to fight again, because they still have 2 more rounds, to determine the ultimate victor. But Achilles now stands and says, quote, "Wrestle no more." And then he says, quote, "Do not wear yourselves out and get hurt. You have both won," end quote. A tie? Participation awards in ancient Greece, right? The Greek love of competition, the agon, and of excellence, arete, is famous, right? And it led them to be the first culture to insist, as we still do today, that all competitions end with just one winner. Sports were often performed by the Greeks, yes, to prepare for war and let off steam, but also simply to prove who was best. And this obsession with individualism and declaring a single victor was absent in other ancient cultures. So this is interesting, right? The Bhagavad Gita in the ancient Sanskrit epic describes a lot of wrestling, but not in the Greek sense of who will stand on top of the Olympic podium. There's often team fighting where 8 different pairs will fight with each other till they're exhausted. No winner is declared. Unimaginable for the Greeks, right? The ancient Egyptian stick fighting also did not have this system of gold medal, or really just first place as all the Greeks. Didn't even really care about silver or bronze as we do today. When Achilles declares this a tie, which he does not do for boxing or the foot or chariot races, he tells us something about wrestling, which seems at first to be extremely un-Greek. But on closer inspection, I would say that we can see in Achilles' treatment of wrestling something that's also vehemently Greek, in the sense of needing to protect oneself from one's own ferocity. Because the Greeks lived in a near constant state of war, with all citizens required to enlist, blood held no special fascination for them. They saw plenty of it. Fascinating instead was this new modern form of fighting, rules-based wrestling, in which men battled viciously yet did not hurt each other. Now that was wondrous. How could you learn how to do it? The encamped citizen soldiers are captivated. Homer mentions no reaction at all to the boxing, but the comrades gaze upon the grappling Odysseus and Ajax, quote, with awe. They are awed by Odysseus' skill, and what is more, by how Achilles manages the bout's immeasurably high stakes. Achilles dangles before them the possibility of losing one of their greatest warriors. At this crucial moment, when the watching soldiers are most tense, Achilles orders Odysseus and Ajax to stand down and be satisfied with a tie. As much as this goes against their desire to determine a single victor, the two men comply. For this order carries great weight coming from Achilles, himself notoriously a man of unbridled rage. Wrestling uniquely produces moments to reflect on such restraint. Wrestling forces its participants and audience to consider the antisocial desires that all societies, including today's, must manage: the lust for dominance, sexual prowess, and revenge. Both wrestling and boxing allow participants to experience these impulses cathartically, but only wrestling offers this with relative safety and dignity. No man need fear being maimed. This protection against injury and humiliation regulates our primitive desires. Neither man will feel compelled to have to avenge his honor. Wrestling can still promulgate antisocial urges, but even this occurs only in an indirect, civilized way. By letting his opponent live, the victor preserves the most important witness to his skills. The loser will warn the world not to mess with the victor. The victorious wrestler can now dominate through reputation without physical force. The restraint of the competitors inspires also discipline in the crowd. They do not want to stoop to the lowly brutality of the boxers. They do not want their emotions to get the best of them. By watching wrestling, the audience has the freedom to ruminate on its own explosive desires without indulging them. So what did the Achaean soldiers think when Achilles prematurely ended the match between Odysseus and Ajax? Were they frightened by the power that these great men did not use, leaving the spectators to fear that this power might now be turned on them? Or were they amazed by the fighters' capacity for restraint? Did their leader, Achilles, intend to stage this containment of man's most primitive desires? Or did he just see a fight getting out of hand and need to stop it? Homer does not tell us. Yet we can guess that the watching soldiers must have been awestruck by how well the vicious Achilles understood the dialectic of civilization. Achilles is merciless on the battlefield, yet rational off it. He has the sense to save his best warriors. He has Odysseus and Ajax fight with great ardor, yet refrain from injuring each other. And now, in conclusion, by being violent to each other, in front of each other, the Greeks affirm what they no longer do. They no longer kill each other casually just because they are angry. They have instead learned the art and sport of wrestling. They generate this theory of wrestling themselves. This has sometimes been proven wrong, but as the Greeks guessed, The danger of not wrestling is greater than the danger of wrestling. Even casual fans today are stunned by how ferociously high schoolers and Olympians grapple, only to politely shake hands or hug at the end. And the regular fan violence at professional soccer matches is absent in Olympic wrestling, MMA, and the harsh Japanese pro wrestling that combines the real and the fake. Just Ronda Rousey fighting MMA, the great Ronda Rousey, and there's an image of the Japanese pro wrestling, which is much harsher than the pro wrestling that we have in North America. It is as if the violence in the ring satisfies any desire for violence outside of it. The brutal embrace seems to be worth it for the Greeks and for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very stimulating. We have a few minutes for maybe 2 or 3 questions before snacks back in.
Sure.
So I certainly invite people to ask questions.
Thank you.
Off the light here, so Carlos, you need to use the mic. No, we're okay. Go ahead.
Thank you for that talk. That was a ton of fun. And it made me think of Charles Taylor in Sources of the Self. He has this discussion comparing Homeric Greeks and their sense of what was an admirable human being and the sources that drove them.
Yes.
And the fundamental figure there would have been Achilles with his unbridled rage, which comes from outside him, right? He allows himself to be possessed by an outside force. Give it a couple hundred years, you've got Aristotle, Plato, with a totally different picture of the self, what is admirable. For them, Achilles would be a bumpkin who allows his emotions to take over the rationality. But the picture you painted for me, it leads me to question whether Taylor is right in portraying it quite that distinct. It seems like, no, that Achilles is very much aspiring for himself and for his people a control over unbridled rage.
Yeah, so, thank you for that. I mean, so Taylor's point here, it's also one lots of people make it, and there have been some counter-arguments against it, but yes, this idea that the pre-classical Greeks have no inner life, right? That they can never be in the position, say, of Hamlet, where they're paralyzed by too much thought. It's a little bit like Nietzsche's argument, too, that this is basically until Socrates and Sophocles, there is no inner life as we know it. And for Nietzsche, this is a horrible development, the inner life, because it paralyzes people, it turns them into frightened cowards and moralists and all these things. And to a large extent, it's true. But because when Odysseus, or when Achilles does this thing at this moment, right, where he decides to break up this fight, he does something that's very modern, that is, I think your point is, right, it would be something that would, satisfy a Platonic understanding of rationality, right? He does something rational at this point. But it's still the case where we have no insight into his inner life. He just doesn't, right? So the Homeric description does not tell us why. In other words, there's no sort of cogitation that's described. Follow up with it,
It makes me think of anthropological work on the opacity of the mind, where there are societies where people simply do not play at all at surmising what is going on in another person's head. Either they think it's not possible, or they don't imagine it as an inner space, or it's impolite. No, really, that's it. It could be just that. They do know there's an inner life, but it's just not polite. to even mention it.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing, and this is a slight digression from this, but you know, the jump between the Homeric characters and then the characters described, say, in Sophocles and especially Euripides, where they're starting to develop these inner lives in classical Greece and Socrates and Plato era as well, is a change in how war was conducted. So after the Trojan War, and nobody knows exactly, but the guess is sort of 8th and 9th century BC, the Greeks invent a new technology of war, the phalanx, where they set up the attacking army in hoplite gear and these shields in a direct, in like a triangle, and they charge forward and just try to charge over the other phalanx with more power pushing forward. And the problem with that new kind of war, even though it was very effective, the problem was it was very hard to become a hero. You could no longer be Achilles fighting alone against Hector. And so one of the theories of why sports become so important is it becomes a psychological ersatz for that experience. This new generation of aristocratic young men in Greece reading about the exploits, the one-on-one fights of the heroes in which Odysseus or Achilles can kill Hector one-on-one, they know they'll never have the chance to do it. And that sports are perhaps invented, especially combat sports, as a poor substitute for glory in war, but the best thing they have would be to become like Milo of Croton and win year after year in the wrestling. So that's another big shift from the Achillean moment, is the characters in classical Greece even worrying about this idea. Okay, sorry.
I was just thinking about, thank you very much for your talk, it was excellent, very interesting. I was thinking there was another advantage to not killing your opponent. Another advantage to having regulated wrestling or unregulated wrestling.
Yeah.
In unregulated wrestling, if you make a mistake, it could be the end of you. You could be maimed, you could be killed. In regulated wrestling, you make a mistake, you lose the fight, but like the example you showed, you might learn something from that. And so it gives the possibility that you can actually improve, right? So it provides a mechanism for advancement by regulating wrestling where you're not having a lethal or maiming outcome. You're actually providing a mechanism for advancement.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I think there's 2 points to what you said. The first one being is it's not only that you don't kill the other person, it means you're not going to get killed, right? Which is great. I can go into this match and I'm not going to get killed. And that, in some ways, what I meant when I was saying that there are aspects of these this invention of sport, specifically combat sport, as the first social contract, or one of the first ones, at least one of the ones that's performed publicly and becomes, in a way, a pedagogical exercise for the rest of the audience too. But also the social contract in the ways that people like Freud and Nietzsche will also point out the undersides of this social contract, because of course a big part of it, not only am I safe, but the downside of it is that I can't let loose of my rage the way I might want to, right? And this is, I think I mentioned at the end of the talk, Achilles' early understanding of the dialectic of civilization, right? If Achilles really wants to win the war, he can't allow a bloodfest to happen here, even though there might be some part of Achilles that would like to, right? So this idea that we have to repress and supplement certain emotions in order to live in a safer world. But the second part you mentioned is also really interesting, right? That by not getting killed, you can get better. Right? You can lose in wrestling, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the great basketball player, once said, you cannot win without losing. And of course what he meant by that is you learn way more through a loss than you do through a victory, and so it becomes a way of progressing. So another way that this early regulation of combat is related to something like an Enlightenment project.
So I was listening, I was trying to relate what you were talking about to modern sport, and how basically, you know how there's showboating is very much we're very against it in general. And I was thinking, obviously, people are against it because of their ego.
Yeah.
But also that like it almost incites your opponents to break to violence outside of like the sanctity of the rules of sport.
Yes, yeah.
And like that's another, like usually you focus more on how it's not proper to have that ego, but also that, you know, it incites that violence that we're trying to subdue with sport in general, and like breaking those rules and bringing like outside violence, which is against this whole concept, and how that's sort of come to modern day.
Yeah. This seems also to have been an important part of the development of rule-making in combat sports. A kind of, let's call it, a kind of prevention of psychological injury. So the first rules that were set up for combat sports are all just about physical injury. And you know, there is actually a papyrus that was found, that people date to roughly 1st century AD of Greek wrestling rules. And it's all about possible physical injury, like no eye gouging, no hitting to the groin, similar stuff that's out, the only few things that are outlawed in UFC today, MMA fighting, no sort of this thing they call fish hooking, where you pull this out. But as wrestling begins to develop, they also start to develop rules against psychological injury. And you know, my son is a wrestler, and I noticed that they've instituted other rules as combat sports have gotten more and more modern. They have this thing now called a technical fall. So if I am beating you by more than 10 points, the match ends. Because the idea is that, it was precisely as you said, if the rules are set up to prevent injury and the desire for bloodlust and revenge, if I kill your cousin, then you have to come back and kill me, right? It's an attempt to break this cycle of bloodlust and revenge. The same kind of psychological injury can cause this. So many rules are set up to prevent the humiliation of the loser. Yeah. So yes, I think you're right. This is part of the same. And exactly why NFL football has rules against taunting. Right after I tackle you, I'm not allowed to go like this because everyone sees what happens.
Yes, and they even set up like baseball has their rebuttal. So if somebody showboats, they'll hit the pitcher,
Yes.
or even really recently like slap shot into the net, basically on an empty netter, and then immediately there's the honor. It's like you do something, you will immediately have the response because you're breaking those.
That's right. That's right. I mean, there's very little on the record about the Greeks doing this, but there is like doing it in the heat of battle.
Yeah.
It's very little on the record about it. I mean, although you have Paeus here in the boxing match making all these threats. He doesn't say anything afterwards because his opponent is completely knocked out. But what the Greeks often did is after they would win in the Olympics, they would engrave a stone in honor of themselves and brag about themselves and how many different people they had defeated, but it was still generally not kind of ad hominem. But that's actually one of the ways that we gather historical data about Greek sports are these kind of bragging stones that people had erected often in their hometowns after they won the Olympics.
Thanks. I was just kind of wondering how kind of social class fits into what you're talking about, because when I think of athletics, especially classical Athens, the usual comment about people that they spend too much time in a place, that's something directed against aristocrats. So do you sense different attitudes, or is what you're, because on one hand you seem to be arguing something kind of widespread, but on the other hand, when I think of classical Athens, I think of athletics in social classes going together. So do you see different kind of critiques of wrestling and maybe what you're talking about, like different voices within Athens or classical Greece?
I guess a couple things. First of all, wrestling, well, all of the sports were primarily aristocratic. There's been some recent research that shows that it wasn't as exclusively aristocratic as we think. Like even someone like Milo of Croton would, as far as people could tell, he was not aristocratic, but he was I guess something we would call today maybe like a craftsman class. So, not obviously not in the underclass, but still, yes, it was mostly aristocratic. I mean, most of the criticism that I come across of the entire sporting culture comes from later and early Roman texts, which basically move entirely against the fictional Solon argument. So the text I was quoting from here is the Lucian text, which is, I think, 1st century AD, a historical, written in Greek, historical reconstruction of how Solon would argue against somebody who comes to him and says, sports are worthless, sort of what you just said, you spend too much time in the palestra. And there are some Latin texts that say, oh, we will have an easy time beating the Greeks because all they do is wrestle, and what good is that in war? So, I don't know much more about a kind of social critique within Athens, but certainly as things progress into late antiquity, wrestling starts to be seen, and remember also as war technology gets more and more advanced, wrestling starts to be seen as some ancient, worthless pastime of the Greeks. And maybe something that aristocratic boys sort of wilded, I don't know, like sailing today or something, what do aristocratic boys do, right? As something that the Romans could dismiss as sort of silly, and there is even one satirical text where the Romans are saying, oh, we had a really hard time against the Greeks, they appeared naked with no weapons, right, as they do in the palestra, and they were pretty easy to defeat. Okay.
Are there any myths displaying women wrestling? Because I know in myth a lot of the time the gender boundaries and roles are different than what they are in real life.
Yeah, that's right. So there was very little actual girls wrestling. This was almost solely the boys were taught, and the boys went to these all-male palestras. But in myth, there were female wrestlers. So, the goddess Atalanta. So she defeated, so we were talking about this today in your class, right? So I was telling the story, so Achilles was conceived in a wrestling ring. His father, Peleus, rapes the goddess Thetis. Thetis is, as a goddess, she's able to change forms. And he gets her in this wrestler's hug. She changes forms into water, into fire, into all these things that will injure him, into like a tiger that claws him up, and he keeps hold of her, and eventually rapes her. But as often in the Greek stories, there's no sort of moral implications here. They get married, and Achilles is born. But this is in the background of this story of the goddess Atalanta, because at some point she is scheduled to wrestle against Peleus. And she hones her skills very well because the stakes are high. She knows that he has wrestled and raped before. So it's not just losing a wrestling match. And she defeats him. And there are lots of Greek pottery and a couple of small sculptures that show Atalanta defeating Peleus in wrestling. There is, like in the Middle Ages, there are two very famous wrestlers, female wrestlers. They both lose key matches, right? So the one is in Beowulf, when Beowulf fights, who can help me here? The monster that Beowulf fights, and then Beowulf fights the mother. Grendel? Grendel, yes. Beowulf first defeats Grendel, and then Grendel's mother is angry, and she comes and wrestles against Beowulf, and actually gives him a better fight than Grendel, but of course Beowulf has to always win. And the mighty Brunhild, who was a great wrestler in the Nibelungen League, but as I mentioned, loses to, it was part of the sort of male narrative of the Middle Ages becoming a hero. But it is interesting that in all of these stories, they actually had to defeat a woman in order to become this manly medieval hero. And then, if you think also to the present day, all kinds of interesting changes are happening. So when I was also a wrestler. When I wrestled in high school and university, there were no female wrestlers at all. So now in my son's high school, there is a girls' wrestling team. And most big high schools in the United States have girls' wrestling teams. You see Ronda Rousey, whom I showed here at the end, has started this new fascination among young girls to be wrestlers and MMA, so mixed martial art fighters, or judo fighters, the way she was. So there seems to be some progression. I wonder how it will continue moving. Yeah, but one other thing to think about, the Greeks, is they didn't have a god of wrestling, they had a goddess of wrestling. And her name was Palestra, very close to the word palestra. And there's a quote, and I can't remember where it is, I think it might be in Apollodorus, but I'm not sure. It says, she was so good at wrestling that her opponents were unable even to touch her breasts. So when you read that, you realize that these female goddesses who were learning wrestling were learning it as a self-defense, right? As a way of fending off a possible sexual violation, which, to some degree is still happening today. You see these self-defense courses that are being set up, and I mean, you never know how effective any of these courses are, but at least they're still based on this idea that I brought up earlier, is that the idea of a technique that allows someone who is smaller to not necessarily lose to someone who is bigger remains important. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's on that again?
It was just an anecdote. There was a women's state champion recently for the first time ever, in for all, not just women's, but men's as well.
I see. Yeah.
Well, I would invite you to, as you leave, to go out to the reception. There's some refreshments, some snacks, and be more opportunity to interact with our speakers. So thank you very much.